During my custody hearing, my lawyer stopped taking notes and said, "Honestly, your ex probably deserves the kids more." I was sitting in the courthouse hallway on a bench outside Judge Catherine Morrison's. Wait, can't use Morrison. Let me restart. I was sitting in the courthouse hallway on a bench outside Judge Catherine Brennan's courtroom when my attorney, Leonard Fitzpatrick, 32 years of family law experience according to his website, set down his legal pad and looked at me with something between pity and contempt. We'd just finished the first day of my custody hearing, 4 hours of my ex-wife's lawyer painting me as an absent, neglectful father who prioritized work over his children. Leonard had barely objected to anything, had failed to cross-examine witnesses effectively, and had let demonstrably false statements stand unchallenged. Now, at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, he was telling me that Claire, my ex-wife, who'd had an affair with her personal trainer and destroyed our marriage, probably deserved primary custody of our 2 kids more than I did. My hands went numb. Around us, other families and lawyers moved through the courthouse corridors, their footsteps echoing on marble floors, completely unaware that my entire world had just imploded. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely steady. "What did you just say?" I'd hired Leonard Fitzpatrick 6 months earlier, right after Claire filed for divorce, and immediately followed up with a custody petition seeking primary physical custody of our daughter Mia, age 8, and our son Noah, age 6. I'd been married to Claire for 11 years, together for 13, and I'd thought we were happy. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Westchester County, New York. I worked as a civil engineer for a construction firm, designing infrastructure projects, making $127,000 a year. Claire had been a stay-at-home mom since Mia was born, her choice, something we'd agreed on together because we'd both wanted our kids to have a parent home during their early years. I'd supported that decision completely, never questioned it, never made her feel less important because she wasn't earning an income. Our life had seemed stable, normal, good. Then one Saturday in March, I'd come home early from a site inspection to find Claire in our bedroom with Derek Mullins, her personal trainer from the gym she'd joined 6 months earlier. The image of them together was burned into my brain, something I'd never unsee. I'd stood there frozen for maybe 5 seconds before Claire had screamed, Derek had scrambled for his clothes, and my marriage had shattered into pieces I'd never be able to put back together. The divorce filing had come 2 weeks later. Claire had moved out, taken the kids to her mother's house in Scarsdale, and served me with papers at my office. Her petition had requested primary custody, child support, alimony, and half of all marital assets. I'd been devastated, but not particularly worried about custody. I was a good father. I'd coached Mia's soccer team, helped Noah with his reading homework every night, made pancakes every Sunday morning, attended every school event and recital. Yes, I worked long hours sometimes, but I was present when I was home. I was engaged, involved, loving. Claire had been the one who destroyed our family with her affair. Surely no judge would penalize me for that. My initial attorney had been a referral from a colleague, a woman named Patricia Kendall, who'd handled his divorce 3 years earlier. But Patricia had called me 2 weeks into the case, sounding uncomfortable. "David, I need to withdraw from your case. I have a conflict of interest I wasn't initially aware of. My firm did some work for Claire's family business 5 years ago. I can't ethically continue representing you." She'd given me 3 referrals. Leonard Fitzpatrick had been the second name on the list, and when I'd called his office, his secretary had gotten me an appointment that same afternoon. Leonard's office had been in White Plains, a suite on the 14th floor of a glass tower, decorated with expensive furniture and framed awards. Leonard himself had been 61, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of presence that suggested competence and success. "David," he'd said, shaking my hand firmly, "Patricia spoke very highly of you. Let me assure you, we're going to fight for your rights as a father. Courts are finally recognizing that fathers are just as capable parents as mothers, and you have a strong case here." I'd explained the situation, the affair, Claire's petition, my relationship with the kids. Leonard had taken detailed notes, asked good questions, and outlined a strategy. "We'll demonstrate that you've been an engaged, present father despite working full-time. We'll show that Claire's infidelity demonstrates poor judgment that could impact the children's well-being. We'll argue for joint custody at minimum and potentially primary custody given her moral failings." His retainer had been $15,000, with additional billing at $450 per hour. I'd paid it immediately, desperate for someone competent to protect my relationship with my kids. The preliminary hearings had gone reasonably well. Leonard had filed appropriate motions, had gotten me temporary visitation every other weekend plus 1 evening per week, had seemed professional and prepared. Then, 3 weeks before the final custody hearing, things had started to feel off. I'd sent Leonard evidence I'd gathered about Claire's affair, screenshots of text messages between her and Derek, credit card statements showing hotel charges on dates when she'd told me she was at her book club, a timeline of her deceptions. Leonard had acknowledged receipt, but seemed unenthusiastic. "David, we need to be careful about making this about the affair. Judges don't like it when divorcing parents try to weaponize their personal grievances. We'll focus on your positive qualities as a father instead." I'd thought that made sense, though it felt wrong not to highlight Claire's choices. Then I'd asked for a meeting to prep for my testimony. Leonard had been evasive, rescheduling 3 times, finally agreeing to meet the day before the hearing for just 30 minutes. You'll be fine, he'd assured me. Just tell the truth about your relationship with your kids. Be honest. Be yourself. The hearing had started at 9 a.m. that Thursday morning. Claire's attorney, a woman named Olivia Strand with 26 years of experience in family law, had been aggressive and thorough. She'd called Claire to testify first, and Claire had presented herself as a devoted mother who'd sacrificed her career to raise the children while I'd been absent, distant, more invested in my work than my family. How many of Mia's soccer games did David attend this season? Olivia had asked. Claire had paused, her expression sad. Maybe 3 out of 12. He was always working late or had site visits. That was a lie. I'd missed 2 games, both because of emergency work situations, and I'd made up for them by taking Mia out for ice cream afterward to hear about the matches. I'd looked at Leonard, waiting for him to object, to cross-examine, to challenge the false statement. He'd written something on his legal pad, but said nothing. Olivia had continued. And Noah's parent-teacher conferences? David missed the last 4, Claire had said. I always went alone. Another lie. I'd missed 1 conference because of a client meeting I couldn't reschedule, and Claire had never even told me about 2 of the others. Leonard had remained silent. The testimony had continued for 2 hours. Claire painting herself as a struggling single mother dealing with an emotionally unavailable husband, me as a workaholic who loved his kids but didn't prioritize them. Some of what she said had kernels of truth twisted into daggers. Yes, I worked long hours sometimes. Yes, I'd been stressed about a major project last fall and had been distracted. But the way she framed it made me sound negligent, uncaring, absent. When it had been time for Leonard to cross-examine, he'd asked soft questions that let Claire elaborate on her narrative instead of challenging it. Mrs. Garrison, you mentioned David worked long hours. Did he ever explain why? He said his projects were important, that we needed the money, but we would have been fine if he'd worked less and been home more. Leonard hadn't pushed back on that. Hadn't pointed out that Claire had wanted a bigger house, private schools for the kids, expensive vacations, all of which required my income. Hadn't asked about her affair, her deception, her choices. After Claire, Olivia had called Claire's mother, Margaret Whitfield, who'd testified that I'd always seemed distant with the children, and that Claire had done all the real parenting. Then she'd called Derek Mullins. Yes, the personal trainer Claire had been sleeping with. I'd expected Leonard to object, to argue relevance, to do something. Instead, Derek had testified that he'd gotten to know the family through training Claire, that he'd seen how devoted she was to the kids, that he'd observed me picking them up from Claire's mother's house during visitation, and I'd always seemed in a hurry and not fully present. I'd wanted to scream. Derek Mullins, the man who'd destroyed my marriage, was testifying about my parenting. But Leonard had just sat there, occasionally writing notes, never objecting. The lunch recess had been from 12:30 to 2 p.m. I tried to talk to Leonard about the morning session, about his lack of objections, about the false statements that had gone unchallenged. It's a process, he'd said vaguely. We'll present our case this afternoon. Don't worry. But when we'd returned to court, Leonard's presentation of my case had been anemic. He'd called me to testify, asked basic questions about my job and my relationship with the kids, but hadn't prepared me for Olivia's cross-examination. She'd been brutal, asking about specific dates I'd missed events, specific instances where I'd chosen work over family, specific moments where the kids had needed me and I hadn't been there. Some of her facts were wrong, but I'd stumbled over my answers, gotten defensive, probably made myself look worse. Leonard hadn't rehabilitated my testimony on redirect, hadn't clarified the misrepresentations, hadn't given me a chance to explain context. By 4:30 p.m., Judge Brennan had called a recess until the following morning. We'll hear closing arguments at 9 a.m. tomorrow, then I'll take the matter under advisement, she'd said. That's when I'd found myself in the hallway with Leonard, and he'd delivered his devastating assessment. Honestly, your ex probably deserves the kids more. I'd stared at him. You're supposed to be my lawyer. You're supposed to be fighting for me. I am being your lawyer, Leonard had said, his tone patronizing. Part of being a good attorney is managing client expectations. David, the reality is that Claire has been the primary caregiver for 8 years. She's demonstrated a level of involvement with the children's daily lives that you simply haven't matched. Judge Brennan is going to award her primary custody. You'll get visitation, maybe even generous visitation, but she's going to be the custodial parent. She had an affair, I'd said, my voice rising. She destroyed our marriage. She lied on the stand today multiple times. You didn't challenge any of it. Because it doesn't matter, Leonard had said impatiently. Judges don't care about infidelity in custody cases. They care about who's been doing the parenting, and that's clearly Claire. You need to accept reality and focus on negotiating the best visitation schedule you can get. I'd felt something crack inside me. Why didn't you object to her false testimony? Why didn't you cross-examine her mother effectively? Why did you let Derek Mullins, her affair partner, testify about my parenting? Leonard had stood up, gathering his papers. David, I've been practicing family law for 32 years. I know what I'm doing. If you're unhappy with my representation, you're welcome to hire someone else. But you'll find that any competent attorney will tell you the same thing. You're fighting a losing battle here. Take the visitation deal, maintain a relationship with your kids, and move on with your life. He'd walked away, leaving me sitting on that bench with my world disintegrating. I'd driven home in a daze, my mind racing. Something was deeply wrong. Leonard's representation hadn't just been incompetent, it had been deliberately inadequate. He'd sabotaged my case. But why? That night, I'd sat in my house, the house that still had Mia's artwork on the refrigerator and Noah's Lego creations on the shelves, and I'd started searching. I'd looked up Leonard Fitzpatrick's case history, his professional associations, his social media, and I'd found something that made my blood run cold. 3 years earlier, Leonard had handled a custody case for a client named Richard Strand, Olivia Strand's husband. They'd lost that case, and Richard had blamed Leonard's representation. There had been a bar complaint, later dismissed, but the connection was there. Leonard Fitzpatrick and Olivia Strand knew each other professionally. They had history. I dug deeper. Found that Leonard and Olivia had co-authored an article for a family law journal 5 years ago. Found photographs of them at bar association events together. Found evidence that they'd worked on opposite sides of at least a dozen cases over the past decade. They were colleagues, possibly friends. And now Leonard was representing me against Olivia's client, my ex-wife, and he was throwing the case. I'd felt sick. Then I'd remembered something. During one of our early meetings, Leonard's secretary had accidentally sent me an email meant for him. She'd recalled it immediately, but not before I'd seen the preview. Garrison case, called O. Strand per your request. I'd thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was some standard professional courtesy, opposing counsels communicating about scheduling or procedure. But now it looked different. It looked like coordination. I'd pulled up my email archive and found the recalled message. The full text had been, Leonard, called O. Strand per your request. She said the arrangement still stands, and she'll make sure Claire is prepped accordingly. Julie. The arrangement. What arrangement? I'd sat there until 2 a.m., compiling everything I could find. The connections between Leonard and Olivia, the recalled email, the pattern of his inadequate representation, the fact that he'd let demonstrable lies stand unchallenged, and I'd made a decision. I wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, at 6:15 a.m., I'd called a legal malpractice attorney I'd found through a late-night Google search. His name was Robert Chen. Wait, can't use Chen. His name was Robert Hutchins, 53 years old, partner at Hutchins & Blackwell, specializing in attorney misconduct cases. I'd left a voicemail explaining my situation, not really expecting a callback. But he'd called me at 7:02 a.m. Mr. Garrison, I got your message. What you're describing sounds like potential legal malpractice and possibly conspiracy to defraud. Can you be at my office at 8 a.m.? I want to hear everything before your hearing resumes. I'd driven to his office in Manhattan, a sleek building in Midtown. Robert had been there waiting, coffee already prepared, a yellow legal pad ready. Start from the beginning, he'd said. I'd told him everything. The affair, the custody case, Leonard's inadequate representation, the connections to Olivia Strand, the recalled email. Robert had listened without interrupting, taking detailed notes. When I'd finished, he'd leaned back in his chair. David, what you're suggesting is serious. You're alleging that your attorney conspired with opposing counsel to sabotage your case. If that's true, it's not just malpractice. It's fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, potentially criminal. I know how it sounds, I'd said. But I have evidence. The email, the pattern of his failures, the connections between them. The email is suggestive but not conclusive, Robert had said. We need more. Do you have access to any other communications from Leonard's office? Any documents that might show coordination with Strand? I'd shaken my head. Just what he sent me, which has been minimal. Robert had thought for a moment. Your hearing resumes at 9 a.m., correct? Do you want me to attend? I can't represent you in the custody matter, but I can observe, document Leonard's conduct, and potentially file an emergency motion to continue the hearing while we investigate. Yes, I'd said. Please. We'd driven to the courthouse together, arriving at 8:47 a.m. Leonard had been waiting outside the courtroom, looking annoyed when he'd seen me with another attorney. David, who's this? Robert Hutchins, Robert had introduced himself. I'm advising Mr. Garrison on a potential malpractice claim related to your representation. Leonard's face had gone pale. That's absurd. I've provided competent representation. We'll see, Robert had said calmly. I'll be observing this morning's proceedings. The closing arguments had started at 9:03 a.m. Olivia Strand had gone first, arguing persuasively that Claire had been the primary caregiver throughout the marriage, that she'd sacrificed her career for the children, that she provided stability and consistency they needed. Her argument had been well-structured, compelling, backed by the testimony from the previous day. Then Leonard had stood to deliver my closing argument. It had been perfunctory, half-hearted, barely 10 minutes long. He'd made weak points about my income providing financial stability, about my love for my children, but he'd failed to challenge any of Claire's narrative. He'd failed to address the affair, the lies, the false testimony. He'd essentially conceded the case. Judge Brennan had thanked both attorneys and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks. As we'd filed out of the courtroom, Robert had pulled me aside. That was deliberate sabotage. No competent attorney would deliver such an inadequate closing argument. We need to file an emergency motion immediately. But before we could leave the courthouse, something unexpected had happened. A woman had approached me in the hallway, someone I didn't recognize. She'd been maybe 45, professionally dressed, holding a large envelope. "David Garrison?" she'd asked. "Yes?" "My name is Melissa Tremaine. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by someone who wants to remain anonymous for now, but who believes you're being treated unfairly in this case. I have information you need to see." She'd handed me the envelope. Inside had been a file folder containing printed emails, text messages, and photographs. The first email had been from Leonard Fitzpatrick to Olivia Strand, dated 2 weeks after I'd hired him. "Olivia, confirmed I'm representing David Garrison in the custody matter. Per our discussion, I'll ensure the case resolves favorably for your client. The usual arrangement applies. LF." The next email, Olivia's response. "Perfect. Claire will cooperate fully. Transfer the first installment to the account we discussed. This should be straightforward. OS." There had been more. Text messages between Leonard and Olivia, discussing strategy, coordinating their approach, mocking me. A bank transfer record showing Olivia had paid Leonard $25,000 2 weeks after I'd hired him. Photographs of Leonard and Olivia having dinner together at an expensive restaurant, toasting with wine glasses, looking very friendly. The evidence had been overwhelming, undeniable. Leonard Fitzpatrick had been paid by my ex-wife's attorney to sabotage my custody case. I'd looked at Melissa Tremaine. "Who hired you? How did you get this?" "I can't tell you who hired me yet," she'd said, "but they want justice, and they thought you deserved to know the truth. Those emails came from a source inside Olivia Strand's law firm, someone who was uncomfortable with what was happening." Robert Hutchins had been reading over my shoulder, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is explosive. This is disbarment-level misconduct, potentially criminal fraud." "What do I do?" I'd asked, my hands shaking as I'd held the evidence of my attorney's betrayal. "We file an emergency motion to vacate any ruling in the custody case," Robert had said immediately. "We petition the court to sanction both Leonard and Olivia. We report them to the Bar Association, and we potentially pursue criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy." "And my custody case?" "We get you a real attorney. We start over. And with this evidence of misconduct, Judge Brennan will likely be very sympathetic to your position." That afternoon, Robert had filed a motion to vacate under seal, attaching the evidence Melissa had provided. He'd also filed a complaint with the New York State Bar Association against both Leonard Fitzpatrick and Olivia Strand. The response had been swift. Judge Brennan had called an emergency hearing for the following morning, Friday, at 9 a.m. When I'd arrived at the courthouse with Robert, Leonard and Olivia had both been there, along with their own attorneys now. They'd looked terrified. Judge Brennan had been coldly furious. She'd read the evidence, questioned both attorneys under oath, and the truth had come spilling out. Leonard and Olivia had known each other for years, had developed what Leonard described as a professional arrangement, where they would occasionally represent opposing clients and coordinate to ensure mutually beneficial outcomes. They'd split fees, manipulated clients, defrauded the court. In my case, Claire had never been part of the scheme. Olivia had approached Leonard after learning he'd been hired to represent me, had offered him $25,000 to ensure Claire won custody. Leonard had agreed. Claire had been just as much a victim as I was, though she'd benefited from it. Judge Brennan had been scathing. "This court has been deceived, Mr. Garrison has been defrauded, and the entire legal system has been undermined by your conduct. I am immediately vacating all proceedings in this case pending investigation. I'm referring both of you to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution, and I'm recommending to the Bar Association that both your licenses be suspended immediately pending disciplinary hearings." Leonard and Olivia had tried to defend themselves, had argued it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence had been too clear. The emails, the bank transfers, the text messages mocking me and coordinating strategy, it was all there. The hearing had ended with both attorneys being escorted out by court security, and Judge Brennan had turned to me. "Mr. Garrison, I apologize on behalf of this court. What was done to you is unconscionable. I'm giving you 60 days to retain new counsel and prepare your case properly. When we reconvene, I'll give your custody petition the fair hearing it should have received from the beginning." I'd been too stunned to respond. Robert had thanked the judge on my behalf. As we'd left the courthouse, reporters had been gathering. Word of the attorney scandal had leaked, and local news stations wanted the story. Robert had handled them, confirming that a major legal ethics violation had been uncovered, but refusing to provide details while the investigation was ongoing. Over the next 2 weeks, the story had exploded. Leonard Fitzpatrick and Olivia Strand had been arrested on fraud charges. The DA's investigation had uncovered at least 8 other cases where they'd engaged in similar schemes, manipulating outcomes and defrauding clients. Both had been disbarred immediately, pending criminal trials. More shocking had been the revelation of who had hired Melissa Tremaine, the private investigator. It had been Patricia Kendall, my first attorney who'd withdrawn due to conflicts of interest. She'd suspected something was wrong when she'd heard Leonard had taken my case. She'd known about his reputation for questionable ethics, had heard rumors about coordination with Olivia Strand. She'd hired Melissa to investigate, to gather evidence, and when Melissa had found proof, Patricia had made sure I received it. Patricia had called me personally to explain. David, I couldn't represent you due to the conflict, but I couldn't let you be victimized either. What Leonard and Olivia did is an affront to the legal profession. I'm glad we were able to expose it. I thanked her, my voice choked with emotion. For the custody case, Patricia had referred me to a genuinely excellent family law attorney named Karen Wolfe, 42 years old, former prosecutor, known for her integrity and skill. Karen had taken my case immediately, had reviewed all the evidence, and had built a real strategy. The new custody hearing had been scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Judge Brennan had granted me expanded visitation, acknowledging that the original temporary orders had been based on tainted proceedings. I'd gotten my kids 3 days a week instead of just weekends. Claire had been devastated when she'd learned about the scheme. She'd had no idea Olivia had bribed my attorney. She'd thought she was just fighting for custody of her children. We'd met for coffee, awkward and painful, but necessary. David, I didn't know, she'd said, tears in her eyes. I thought Olivia was just being a good attorney. I didn't know she was rigging the case. I know, I'd said, and I'd believed her. Claire was a lot of things, unfaithful, selfish in some ways, but she wasn't criminal. What do we do now? She'd asked. We figure out what's actually best for Mia and Noah, I'd said. Not what attorneys tell us to fight for, but what actually serves our kids. We'd talked for 2 hours, really talked for the first time since I'd discovered her affair, and we'd reached an understanding. The official custody hearing with Karen Wolfe representing me had been almost anticlimactic. Claire's new attorney, a straightforward lawyer named Dennis Harper, had been professional and honest. We'd presented our cases fairly, without lies or manipulation. Judge Brennan had listened carefully, had asked thoughtful questions, and had issued a ruling that actually made sense. Joint legal custody, with a 60-40 physical custody split. Claire would have the kids slightly more because she had more flexible hours and had been the primary caregiver historically, but I'd have them 3 days a week, plus alternating holidays, plus significant summer vacation time. It was fair. It was reasonable. It prioritized what was actually best for Mia and Noah, rather than what either parent's ego demanded. 6 months later, Leonard Fitzpatrick and Olivia Strand had both been convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Leonard had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Olivia had received 2 years. Both had been ordered to pay restitution to their victims, including $40,000 to me for the legal fees I'd paid Leonard. The 8 other cases they'd manipulated had been reopened, and those families were getting their fair hearings too. Patricia Kendall had been recognized by the State Bar Association for her ethics and integrity in exposing the scheme. Melissa Tremaine had testified at the criminal trials, explaining how she'd infiltrated Olivia's firm by posing as a potential client and had accessed the incriminating emails through a source who'd been disturbed by what they'd witnessed. My relationship with my kids had stabilized. Mia and Noah spent every Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday with me. We'd developed our own routines, our own inside jokes, our own way of being a family, even though Claire and I weren't together anymore. I'd started dating again, carefully, someone I'd met at work who understood that my kids were my priority. Claire had broken up with Derek Mullins shortly after the scandal broke. Apparently, the stress of the custody battle and the embarrassment of the attorney's arrests had killed whatever relationship they'd had. She was single now, focused on the kids, and we'd developed a functional co-parenting relationship. We'd never be friends, but we could be respectful partners in raising our children. 1 year after that devastating moment when Leonard had told me Claire deserved the kids more, I'd been sitting in the same courthouse for a different reason. Mia had won an award at school, and both Claire and I had been invited to an assembly. We'd sat together, watched our daughter accept her achievement medal, and afterward we'd taken her out for ice cream. "This is nice," Mia had said, chocolate ice cream on her nose. "You and Mom being nice to each other." "We're trying, sweetheart," I'd said. "We both love you and Noah more than anything." Claire had looked at me across the table, and for a moment I'd seen regret in her eyes. Not for the divorce, that had been necessary, but for the pain, for the battle, for the attorneys who'd tried to turn our kids into weapons. "We should have done this from the beginning," she'd said quietly. "Just talked. Just figured it out ourselves." "We were hurt," I'd said. "We let lawyers tell us what to fight for instead of figuring out what actually mattered." "I'm glad we figured it out eventually," she'd said. Me too. The irony wasn't lost on me. Leonard Fitzpatrick had sabotaged my case, had betrayed my trust, had tried to destroy my relationship with my kids. But in doing so, he'd exposed a larger corruption, had forced Claire and me to actually communicate, and had ultimately led to an outcome that was better for everyone. Not because of him, but in spite of him. I'd thought about that moment on the courthouse bench a lot. The moment when my attorney had told me my ex probably deserved the kids more. The moment when I'd felt completely powerless, completely betrayed. That moment had been the beginning of the fight, but it hadn't been the end of the story. The end of the story was me with my kids, building a life that worked, proving that being a good father wasn't about winning in court. It was about showing up, being present, fighting for what mattered. Leonard had said Claire deserved the kids more. He'd been wrong. Not because I deserved them more, but because deserve wasn't the right framework. Mia and Noah weren't trophies to be won or lost. They were children who needed both their parents, who benefited from both of us being involved, who were better off with us cooperating than competing. That's what Leonard and Olivia had never understood. In their world, family law was a game, a transaction, an opportunity to profit. In the real world, it was people's lives, children's futures, relationships that mattered more than billable hours or legal victories. A year later, I'd visited Leonard in prison. Robert Hutchins had thought I was crazy, but I'd needed to do it. Leonard had been diminished, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of an expensive suit, looking older than his 62 years. "Why are you here?" he'd asked when we'd sat down in the visiting room. "To tell you that I forgive you," I'd said. His eyes had widened. "I don't understand." "You almost destroyed my relationship with my kids," I'd said. "You betrayed every ethical duty you had. You deserved everything that happened to you. But holding on to anger about it doesn't serve me or my children. So I forgive you. Not for you. For me." Leonard had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said, "I'm sorry. Truly. I let greed corrupt everything I was supposed to stand for. I don't expect you to accept my apology, but I needed to say it." "I accept it," I'd said. "And I hope you use your time here to figure out who you want to be when you get out." I'd left that prison feeling lighter. Free. The man who'd tried to take my children from me had no power over me anymore. I'd won, not in court, but in the ways that actually mattered. My kids knew I loved them. I was present in their lives. And I'd learned that the system, for all its flaws, could still deliver justice when good people fought for it. Patricia Kendall had fought for it by exposing corruption. Robert Hutchins had fought for it by taking my case seriously. Judge Brennan had fought for it by holding attorneys accountable. Melissa Tremaine had fought for it by gathering evidence. And I'd fought for it by refusing to give up, even when my own lawyer had told me I should. That's what I wanted Mia and Noah to learn from all this. That systems aren't perfect, that people will sometimes fail you or betray you, but that you fight anyway. You fight for what's right, for what matters, for the people you love. You fight with integrity, with evidence, with truth. And when you do that, when you refuse to be a victim, you can win. Not every time, not easily, but you can win. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.